Welcome to our podcast, Snap Crackle Pod. I'm David Rice, the CEO and co-founder of Snap Analytics. We're absolutely delighted to welcome Freddy Guard from our partners Snowflake, who is the head of industry go-to-market for consumer goods, and Tim Andrews, who is the Snap Analytics subject matter expert in the consumer goods space. So Freddy, Tim, welcome to the podcast. Freddy, I think to begin with you and your role and your career, it'd be great to get a bit of background on your role, what you do day to day, and a bit of an introduction.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. Appreciate you having us on the podcast. Like you mentioned, my name is Freddy Guard, and I lead up our global efforts for consumer goods here at Snowflake. So I'm part of the industry team. And what we are, from a roles perspective, we are focused on making sure that our customers, prospects get the most value out of the technology platform that they're investing in with Snowflake, and how can we help them solve business challenges with data and technology. My background prior to Snowflake, I spent almost a couple decades now in the CPG and consumer goods world, all in roles at the intersection of data, business, and mainly focused on driving outcomes. And that's what I do here as well. And it involves a lot of discussions with partners such as Snap Analytics to bring to bear the right industry solutions for our customers. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Great to have you on board, Freddie, and on the podcast. Tim, it'd be great to hear a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and nice to be on this podcast with you, Freddie, also. So my name's Tim Andrews. I'm a client delivery lead at Snap Analytics. I've been with the company for just over 2 years, 2.5 years, and as well as leading projects, some of which are in the CPG space, I'm also the lead of the data visualization capability, so I'm very passionate about data visualization. In the past, I've spent a lot of time working in this space, so I had about 15 years working at Cadbury, which then became Mondelez International. I've also worked on some projects at Unilever in the very distant past, working with some CPG clients right now. And I had a brief departure into the automotive industry for about 4 years as well, in amongst all of that, in a variety of different data roles. But really, really happy to be talking about the CPG space today.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. So, I mean, it's been a wild 5 years, lots happening in the industry. There's been a lot of economic and political turmoil. We had COVID-19. There's been challenges with sort of global supply chains, with wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and it's been a very, very uncertain sort of period, and lots of price fluctuations and things. So how have you guys seen, the impact of that on consumer goods companies, and what has been the sort of difference between companies that have had data and been able to be agile and responsive, and those that maybe haven't had the information? Data presumably has been a really important factor in navigating these uncertain times. And I guess, Freddie, it'd be great to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it, David, when you said uncertainty. The last 5 years have been a constant series of challenges for most consumer goods companies. If you think about it, in the last year, obviously inflation was the largest one. Most organizations ended up taking multiple rounds of pricing. For the most part, the growth held up till probably the last 6 months. We're seeing a lot of slowness in growth, organic growth for most of the brands, and that is causing a lot of concern for the next 12, 18 months. So there seems to be a big focus on trying to figure out how our organization is going to drive organic growth, profitable organic growth at that, because margins are challenged as well still. And then you look at the macroeconomic factors, there are quite a few major shifts happening from a consumer dynamics perspective. So if you're a global brand, the number one challenge is slowness in China. One of the largest markets for all consumer brands, there is a lot of uncertainty in China in terms of how long this consumer slowdown is going to last in that market. What does that mean? The other bit is the middle class in most developed markets in North America, in Europe, is squeezed in terms of disposable income. Inflation is going to moderate, but it's probably going to continue. So that's another big one. And then when you think about emerging markets, there's this whole, shift happening to the younger consumer. So younger consumers have more disposable income. There is a need to kind of figure out how are you going to tap into these market shifts and dynamics. So from a data perspective, seems to be a lot more movement in terms of figuring out consumer behavior at a more granular level. How do you really balance your go-to-market methods between direct-to-consumer and wholesale? And then supply chain is going to continue to be a big factor for the next 12, 18, 24 months and beyond, because a lot of the supply chains are undergoing transformations that are potentially going to last multi-years before they can really pivot.
Fantastic. Thanks, Freddie. And I guess, the attempts to kind of follow the consumer behavior and the new trends in the market, I know, things like plant-based foods are, I guess, again, really, you need the data to back that up, right? So to really understand consumer behaviors, where the trends are going, are they sustainable and long-term trends? How much of an impact is how much of an influence, is data in actually making decisions to go and sort of try to attain some of, I guess, organic and inorganic growth, because we're seeing a few acquisitions in our client base around things like plant-based. Are you seeing a similar trend, and how much is data sort of supporting and driving that?
Absolutely. I think one thing that most organizations have realized, that while they have a lot of data within their four walls, it's not completely capturing consumer behavior, because consumer behavior interacts with a lot more brands than just a particular organization's brands. So there is more and more of a need and desire to tap into external data sources. And it's everything from understanding product attributes that go beyond just what is on the package, to really understand what is driving product usage, product trends, all the way to figuring out potential risks and shifts from a behavior perspective. So there is a ecosystem that's getting developed in most CPG companies, where they're trying to figure out how to better leverage their own first-party data, how to better collaborate on data sharing with partners, be it logistics partners, media partners, retailers. And then the third bit is, how can you get access to more relevant third-party data that might be out there, whether it's macroeconomic factors, weather, events, all kinds of things that will really help you complete that consumer picture.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think, Tim, that's probably a good point to bring you in, because I know we're doing quite a bit of work with external data sources, things like weather, things like SKU Track, which I know also hosts a lot of their data in Snowflake. So yeah, what have you seen in terms of value being created from some of those sort of external data sources?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we've been doing some really exciting work with SKU Track data, which of course is the EPOS data that's provided to SKU Track by the major retailers in the UK. And what we've been doing is sort of blending that with internal clients' data, so that it can be looked at through the lens of their product and customer hierarchies. That's enabling some really, really cool work. So for example, being able to look at seasonal business and really get a picture of how the season's progressing during the season, react really fast to any changes, make sure that product is supplied into stores and depots to meet the demand, and also try and look ahead and prevent overstocking. I think waste is a big issue still, despite all of the advances in the logistics. So that's been a really exciting piece of work. Also, obviously, providers of data like Circana. So Freddie, I think you alluded to not just having a picture of your own brands, but also being able to see the wider picture of what's going on in terms of market share is really important. And as you both alluded to, weather is a really significant thing that drives demand and sort of impulse buys in the CPG space. So we've managed to work with a very good and very cheap provider of weather data, actually, and being able to bring that in terms of looking at sales and the impact of weather on those. Another thing is geographical data. So we've been looking at in the UK data from the Office of National Statistics to sort of enrich some of the third-party data sources and get a bit of a better geographical feel for what's going on out there. So yeah, there's lots more to go at, but I think we've made some pretty good strides in those spaces.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think that is where I guess, the idea of the data cloud and being able to quickly tap into external sources of information becomes really, really valuable. So Tim, I think, one of the topics you mentioned is wastage. I think, a year ago, we were having lots of conversations around ESG, so environmental, social, and governance. That was one of the big themes. I think with a lot of the sort of, I guess, economic, political kind of turmoil that's going on, it does seem maybe to have moved off the agenda to some degree. Is that what you're seeing in the market, and is that something that will come back and be at the forefront again? I guess, Tim, it'd be good to get your perspective.
Well, I think the early sort of work that we did in the ESG space was very much the E, if you like. So there was a lot of keenness and requirement, if you like, to be able to produce statistics about recycling in terms of packaging. That was a really, really key focus area. And we've enabled, clients of ours to be able to submit reports to the various bodies that are tracking that. I think we've now seen a little bit more in the sort of S&G, so, interest in nutrition reporting. There's obviously the high fat, sugar and salts legislation, and the way that products that are, let's say, less healthy can be displayed. And you alluded to, sort of plant-based products and more healthy ingredients. I think there's definitely a focus there. And there's also, kind of social aspirations around food donations. But it does feel as though maybe it is sort of dying down a little bit in terms of its prioritization within organizations because of the climate that you mentioned. But I think inevitably it will come back. These things are not going to be sort of gone forever. They will come back, sort of up the priority list sooner rather than later. Another area that we've sort of looked at a little bit is CO2 emissions, which is obviously very, very key in the current climate. Use the word climate there, but it's a very, very, very key topic. I think that's quite a hard problem to solve, but I think it's something where you're never going to get the answer 100% correct. But that shouldn't put companies off attempting to get a handle on it, because you can. We have some good ideas, I think, about how you can solve that problem and how you can measure it. So it's something that we're also cognizant of.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think, Tim, what you mentioned is similar to what we are seeing. I feel like probably if you look back a couple of years, there were two forces changing this whole ESG conversation. One was obviously coming from the regulation side and the government pushing for it, but then there was also there's this rise of more consciousness with the new consumer. The younger consumer is definitely wanting to, engage with brands that tie more closely with their values, and that was another pull for ESG. In the last year, while inflation's hit, the actual price value of a product has taken more of an importance, and hence there's been a little bit of a dying down of the push from an ESG perspective. But there is no doubt that from a governance perspective and from large organizations wanting to do the right things, there's still going to be a push. So it's going to come back for sure. I think emissions is a big one, like you mentioned, Tim. We are seeing certain organizations trying to figure out, at least for their own fleets, potentially turning to electric, trucks, etc. to begin with. On the sustainability side, lots happening with the packaging space. We are seeing some very interesting examples appear in the CPG space. Everything from food to alcoholic beverages are experimenting with what's going to be a sustainable packaging change that they can come about. The harder one that I feel is around governance, and there's a lot happening where organizations are trying to figure out their entire supply chain and be transparency in the supply chain, especially for overseas manufactured sources and third-party manufacturing. That is going to be an interesting challenge, but there's definitely a movement underway to try and figure out alternate suppliers potentially that tie more closely with their own goals of governance and sustainability.
And I guess it comes back to that point sort of we alluded to early on around agility, being able to be agile, because in times of uncertainty, there are certain regions of the world you may not want to be buying from right now, or may not be able to produce the wheat in Ukraine was a good example, right? A big percentage of the world's wheat was produced in Ukraine, and obviously that's tailed off. So I think that agility and the only certainty is change, right? And the only certainty is uncertainty, I guess, in these times. So yeah, I think having that visibility, understanding where certain raw materials are coming from in the supply chain and what alternatives there are, I guess becomes even more important. And I guess even things like currency fluctuations and exchange rates is going to have quite a big impact on costs over time in the future as well. So yeah, definitely a really, really interesting topic. So Freddie, just to sort of change tack slightly, so what data can provide tremendous value in the consumer goods space. What are some of those really high value use cases that you're seeing with Snowflake clients right now?
Yeah, so like we mentioned earlier, everybody is on this data journey. They want to control their own destiny when it comes to figuring out business results through data. What that has done is, number one, trying to get a more complete view of the consumer journey is what a lot of customers are focused against. Because in a lot of organizations, even simple things like DTC businesses were managed separately from wholesale businesses, were potentially managed differently than third-party e-commerce platforms. From a business perspective, it might have made sense because there's slightly different business models. But from a data challenges perspective, now you've got like 3 separate sets of data potentially out there, and nobody's looking at it holistically across the entire consumer journey, because in a lot of cases, it's the same consumer with multiple touch points with your brand. So there's a lot happening there in trying to figure out, how do I bring all the data together? And then how do I measure effectiveness of my media? That's a big one because that's a big budget in most CPG companies. How do I better target consumers? How do I maximize my distribution points? And maximize my distribution points, not in the sense of just opening new doors, but the existing doors I have, do I understand exactly who's shopping there? What can I offer them next? So there's a lot happening in that space, we feel like. Another big area that, especially in Europe and in North America, is around retail media networks. And where are brands going to invest? Who are they going to invest with? How are they going to measure those investments and measure them across media networks? Because right now, nobody can really measure on a consistent basis across media networks. So that's going to be another large area that we see a lot happening in. And then I think to Tim's earlier point, there's also a real focus on being more efficient, especially from a supply chain perspective in terms of preventing waste. And waste happens in 2 ways. One is obviously if you're overstocking, you're potentially having to either put it on discount or liquidate it at some point, or it is spoiled in certain cases if it's fresh food. But there's also wastage when you're undersupplying, because then you're wasting your promotional dollars, you're wasting your media dollars. So there is a lot of focus on how do you make sure that you're getting a complete visibility from demand generation all the way to demand fulfillment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's a difficult trade-off, isn't it? Is making sure you've got enough availability being shipped to stores so that your product is there on the shelf, but also making sure there's not too much of that product there, so that you end up having a lot of wastage. Tim, is that a challenge that you've seen and had to try and address?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots to go at, I think, in that space. But it reminds me of a piece of work I did some time ago, which was looking at aged stock, so the profile of stock within the business that was going, reaching its sort of sell by date. Of course, the products that have a short shelf life or approaching a short shelf life can still be sold. They don't have to be, disposed of. There are different channels in which you can sell aging stock. And a project that I did at Cadbury some time ago was to develop a piece of data visualization that enabled a department to sort of see stock that was approaching its out of life. And there were channels where, the stock could be kind of jobbed off into, discounters at that time or other different types of outlet. So a relatively simple piece of data visualization there, embedded within a business process where there are actually clear decision points, helped to save an awful lot of money. I think there's a lot to go at in that space still. I bet there are other businesses that haven't got a complete handle on that if they're completely honest.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know something we've spoken about, Tim, is it's tempting, isn't it, to go after the new shiny stuff, the Gen AI use cases. But actually, a lot of the time we see that some of our clients, there are some fairly core fundamentals around just having access to certain data sets, having connected data, and being able to create some relatively rudimentary insights. But actually, some of those can actually move the needle quite significantly. I know it's something that you've spoke about before.
Yeah, I think inevitably there's an awful lot of marketing about the next wave of AI, and of course we're very interested in that and keen to be knowledge experts in that area and deliver value. But I think there can be a sense of FOMO with that. I think people can sort of perceive that others are doing great stuff in that space, and they need to invest all of their chips on that particular thing. But I think most clients that we talk to, Dave, and Freddie, I'm sure it's the same when you talk to customers of yours. There are AI use cases, of course, but there's also a lot of lower hanging fruit. I hate to use that expression, but there are easier, quicker wins that shouldn't be ignored just because there is this sort of sense of FOMO about using machine learning and AI.
Yeah, Freddie, is that what you see?
Yeah, very. I mean, I was smiling as Tim was talking about, some of what you guys are seeing. It's very similar. Like with any other technology, it seems to sort of. I've seen a few of these waves in my time in CPG, and it always seems to follow a similar wave. With Gen AI, obviously, there was a lot of, public euphoria, if you will, with all the access you can get through ChatGPT and what it was able to do. It captured everybody's imagination. So what's happening is there's the C-level asking the question, what is our Gen AI strategy? And then the C-1, C-2 are scrambling to figure out what that means for their organizations. The number one thing is, like David, you mentioned, for a lot of organizations, it's important to realize what are the building blocks to really get to Gen AI at an enterprise level. And the number one is, do you even have your data together? Do you have the right data? Are you governing the right data in the right manner? Because if you don't, then none of the other things will matter. So the data strategy is number one in the building blocks, I feel like. And there's a lot to be done for a lot of CPG organizations just to get that fundamental data strategy right. The ability that Tim was mentioning about bringing different data sources together seamlessly and being able to scale those up into usable BI outputs or actual results from a functional perspective, there are quite a few organizations still struggling with that, right? So number one, how do you get your data strategy to the point where you have the right data, govern the right data? Do you have a data platform that can help you work with all data types? Interoperability is going to be key because these capabilities are going to get expensive very, very quickly. So do you have a platform that's easy to manage? Can you manage it and give access to this right platform and bring the right models to the platform? Because everybody's going to have access to the same models eventually. Most CPG companies are not going to develop their own LLMs. They're going to go out and source public LLMs. Can you bring those LLMs to your private data versus having to take your private data into those public domains? That's another governance feature that's going to be key. The other bit that we talk about a lot with our customers is the need to make sure you're not only governing the data, but you're also governing your use cases. And I think we have to constantly remind organizations all these technologies are great enablers, but you're trying to drive business results at the end of the day. So, what is your business challenge to solve? If you cannot articulate that clearly, then you should not be thinking about how to apply Gen AI to that challenge. And then that's my counsel mainly as we think about it. So there's a lot that's happening in this space. There's a lot of experimentation happening, but there is a lot to be figured out from scaling of the enterprise level AI capabilities.
Yeah, I
think,
think it's
sorry.
a great perspective, and there's a lot to unpack there. I think you talked about governance. So I think AI needs well governed, well organized, well connected data. Ultimately, and I always say AI is the 5%, right? 95% is around how do we model and organize that data? Because what we often see is people kind of rushing towards AI. And trying very quickly to get all of their data into the platform, and that's great. But it's then the value creation really comes between how is developed by organizing and curating and getting that data ready and the right data at the right time. So I think that's really important. I think you also talked about the focus on value creation, right? You might be doing things fantastically. You might have the best CI/CD pipelines in the world. So you might be doing things right, but you might be doing the wrong things. So ultimately, doing the right things, the things that are going to really move the needle and add value to the organization, is something that often gets forgotten. And I think sometimes projects can be very tech led. So it's an IT team. We've got some new toys. We can do loads of cool stuff. We can bring in all of the data. But actually, it's always having to loop back to that value question, right? How are we actually going to create value? Is it that we're going to reduce wastage for the organization by 10 million? So look, fantastic use case, guys. We're going to help the environment, and we're actually also going to help the organization's bottom line here. Let's focus on this rather than necessarily just going after we want to build a report for John because John sits in the corner and he's banging on his desk saying he needs this report. He's like always looping back to the strategic. Nothing against John, but at the same time, I think it's really important that we're always asking the question: why are we doing this? How does it create value for the organization? Tim, sorry, I know you.
I just wanted to add to that. I think. Maybe what this gives rise to is more emphasis on problem framing. So it's great having technology, it's great having aspirations in this space to make use of it. But are we solving the right problems, and are we building something that's actually going to deliver value? Who's going to use it? How are they going to use it? How does it fit into a business process or a decision making process? When I worked at Jaguar Land Rover, which I know is not necessarily directly in the space. In the analytics team there were a couple of brilliant individuals who I shan't name, but were incredibly good at problem framing. So rather than just sort of rushing into a project and thinking, we need to generate some output in this space, there would almost be a bit of a kind of dragon's den process around, tell me what you're trying to solve, and we'll think about whether that's going to work. I could see that being equally as relevant in the CPG space as anywhere else. Really thinking very, very hard about which are the right problems to go after, whether they actually fit with Gen AI or whatever people are putting forward. And it's actually it's a real skill. It's a very, very difficult skill.
Absolutely. And Tim, the other thing you mentioned is also worth spending a minute on is how are you going to get those outputs from your advanced techniques in the hands of business users so they can actually adopt it into their day-to-day workings, or potentially it changes their day-to-day workings, right? So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of being able to figure out what do those data products look like at the end of the day. How are you going to create potentially applications out of it that business users can interact with using business logic rather than having to learn technical skills?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a great segue into my next question around adoption, right? I think we will have all seen expensive solutions being created, expensive, I say, from a sense of time and effort from either consultancies or people internally, building out the elaborate data warehouses, data platforms, and then the end users maybe not adopting those solutions in the way that you anticipate or expect. And I think, Freddie, you allude to the sort of, that skills barrier, right? If you have to learn, some of those BI tools, then, they on the face of it, it looks like they're nice charts and they're drag and drop. But when you get deep into it, actually, there is some nuance and some complexity. So, I think, how do we drive adoption? How do we create tools and solutions that really are enablers? I think AI is probably a part of that, because we can start to ask questions and get answers. I think we're maybe a little way away from getting 100% accuracy on some of those models, so we've got to be a bit careful on the use cases that we use that approach for. But in terms of driving adoption, how do we change that? How do we elevate that and ensure that businesses really are starting to utilize and become truly data driven? I guess, Freddie, I'll put that to you first.
Sure. So I think one lens to always keep in mind, both from an internal CPG perspective or as a partner to CPGs, is they're not in the business of managing data. They're in the business of managing their business. So any capabilities you bring to bear, in my mind, has to have a few things. Number one, it has to be simple. And what I mean is, it's not necessarily a technology that has to be simplistic, but it has to be simple to adopt. So a simple platform, managed platform, the ability to then have some infrastructure that is flexible is another key, so that you're not having to rebuild everything every time you have a new solution in place. So do you have an infrastructure that then can be scaled to take advantage of the best in breed solutions that you can bring to bear from your vendor partners? You don't need to build everything in-house. You can rely on experts in the field to bring the right solutions to you. But do you have the infrastructure that lets them do that without you having to build it every time? And then the third bit is, can we get technology and business on the same page? That's another key factor in terms of making sure there is complete alignment and understanding in terms of what is being built from a technology perspective, and at the end of the day, what business solutions are they going to drive? And then being able to bring business along on that technical journey with, delivering quick wins, so that you can start developing that adoption, the belief in the new technologies, and then start getting evangelists that help you scale that up in a much more significant manner.
Fantastic. And yeah, I think, those evangelists in the organization are really important, aren't they? I think if you haven't got a champion in the business, or somebody that really believes in that solution, it's very difficult to drive adoption. And as you say, it's not all about technology. I think having those individuals in the organization, either internally or your partners, your SIs, that can actually bridge the gap and communicate and act almost as translators between the business and the technology team. I think that's really, really important. And it's definitely something over the years I've seen as a key kind of determinant of success in projects. I think I would always caution against just sort of landing a team of what I call sort of technical folk who can build, I'm sure, fantastic solutions. But actually, I think 60-70% of the challenge is communication. How do we communicate? How do we talk about the value we're creating? How do we simplify the solutions in terms of the way we communicate them to key stakeholders? I think, we can sometimes be guilty of having those big sort of complex data models, architecture diagrams, and then we sit in a room with the CFO and go, hey, look at my wonderful architecture, look at my wonderful data model. Ultimately, they're not interested in that, and they don't understand it, and we shouldn't expect them to. I think it's that communication is so important. I think technology can also be something that is has an impact on the simplicity and driving adoption. So I think, Tim, have you seen anything in particular that is sort of working in terms of simplifying the language, driving it?
So I think this is a big problem, right? Despite all of the amazing work that we all do, I do think user adoption and democratization of data is still a challenge. Um, and that's despite the fact that there are some brilliant tools out there, some wonderful data visualization tools out there that enable us to produce fantastic, outputs. But I think the issue with that is that, in the hands of the average business user, the adoption of a quite complicated data visualization tool is probably only a success rate of about 25%. There's various statistics out there that say, if you put a modern visual data tool in the hands of a typical business user, only 25 out of 100 will actually stick with that and keep using it. So there is a product out there that I think has a slightly different idea, and I think potentially is going to make great strides. And that's Sigma Computing, who I know are close partner with Snowflake, and a company that we're getting to know quite well. And they are unashamedly a spreadsheet UI. So it's a cloud-first platform, but the UI is very much like a spreadsheet and contains a lot of the sort of functionality that business users are very much used to seeing. But it can also do data visualization as well. It doesn't allow kind of cottage industries of localized files. Everything stays in the data warehouse. But the UI is incredibly simple. And their hypothesis is that, if you give 100 people their tool, probably 80, 90 out of 100 will continue to use it, rather than the 25 in a sort of more complicated VI data visualization tool. So I think that's a really interesting thing to follow.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating, isn't it? I think one of the first questions we often get asked, especially if you go into sort of maybe a finance team, is can I get it in Excel, or can I download it into Excel? So we have the most elaborate, incredible, scalable platform. We've invested a lot of time and energy getting the data into a model, a semantic layer that they can drag and drop and slice and dice. And the question you get is, that's all great, but can I get it in Excel? So I think definitely we see Sigma as a tool that is hopefully gonna change that question. We'll say you can have it in Excel, but you won't be able to share it. It's not going to be scalable. What if we can give it to you in something that looks just like Excel, but you can start to slice and dice and query your billion rows of data? You can share it, and you can ensure you've still got a single source of truth and haven't got those cottage industries. So I think, it's going to be an interesting to see that play out. But I think, definitely there's a lot of promise in that space. So I'm going to move on a little bit here. We do have to talk about AI, right? It is going to be transformational. As I say, it's an evolution. We're seeing lots of use cases. I think we are maybe seeing some customers some clients having challenges getting those use cases into production. And I think maybe Freddie alluded to, you've got to get your foundations right. I think that having good governance, having good quality data is going to be really fundamental in being able to drive adoption, as is having scalable technology that enables you to do that. Technology does play a really key part. Of course, we talked about the importance of people, the importance of technology, the importance of process and governance, and the data and quality of the data itself. So it really is multifaceted. I think everything has to come together to really enable the adoption and those solutions to be productionized. It's not just a people or a technology problem. You've got to get that formula right to drive that. But how do you guys see AI impacting the CPG space? Are there any sort of low-hanging fruit, ideal use cases? So if I'm a chief data officer for a large global CPG company, and I'm getting asked, what are you guys doing about AI? Where do I start? Where do I start to look for that use case that is really going to be transformative for the business and help me make a big impact on the business? I guess, Freddie, to ask you that question first.
Sure. So we're seeing, I see three areas in which there's a lot of experimentation happening from a CPG perspective with Gen AI. Number one is around chatbots, agents, both internal and external. So quite a few companies are figuring out how to use Gen AI for customer contact centers, for example. that can really help with, everything from sentiment analysis to just summarization of call transcripts to really start gaining some insights on what might be happening. Product recalls is a huge challenge in most CPG companies, especially food and beverage. And then when that happens, sometimes the early signals are missed. So just imagine if you're able to detect something a little bit faster, there's some significant improvements that you can expect from dealing with a crisis like that. Or, we're seeing chatbots being adopted internally for everything from HR to finance to just answer some simple questions. Monday morning reporting, that's another place where we are seeing CPG starting to ask questions in natural language. That's one area. The second area that I see is around content generation. So marketers are using Gen AI for visual or messaging content generation. The only watch out there is to make sure that the models are being trained on proprietary data and there are no IP, infringements happening out there. But that's another space that's really exciting because you're seeing some very quick ideation versus having to physically produce all that content. And then the third bit that I think is probably the most exciting, might not be the most glamorous, but the most exciting, in my opinion, is around document intelligence. So there are so many physical digital documents sitting out in most of our CPG organizations, everything from contracts to, consumer insights, studies to, reports. All of these are in unstructured text. Gen AI has some great capabilities to really be able to summarize those and get a lot more value out of those documents. And I think that unlock is going to be massive at scale for most of these organizations.
Yeah, fantastic. So, yeah, no, some great use cases there. I think one of the things we've done recently, and we spoke about this at Big Data London recently, one of our clients has a product catalog of about 30,000 different, very, very complex products, and the ability to scan all of those documents and actually ask questions about those products and their specifications and things like that is really, really quite exciting. So I know, Tim, we've done some work in the customer service space with one of our big CPG clients. So I know I've got a bit of experience delivering some real AI use cases. So yeah, it'd be great to get your perspective on where you think AI is gonna have an impact.
I think we've already seen that. So you both mentioned the kind of consumer contact area. So we've seen a piece of work where the sort of highly verbose bits of feedback which you get from consumer contact can be sort of categorized. Sentiment analysis can categorize it into a type very, very quickly, so that it's very much easier for people to analyze. But also you can go beyond that, with some sort of internal business context and get it to generate next best action. So, what do I do with this type of complaint? What's the right thing for me to do in response? So I think that's a real possibility, something where we've done a POC already. I could see some good work in that area. I guess in the CPG space, we don't necessarily have product specifications of the complexity that you talked of, Dave, in elsewhere. But nevertheless, I'm sure that in terms of document intelligence, possibly even in terms of reviewing purchase agreements or things of that nature, there's lots of old contracts that exist within the business that aren't necessarily fully digitalized. So there's opportunities there as well, I think. I'm a little suspicious of the content generation thing. I know it's obviously a big thing and we're all using it to some extent. I saw a really great post that somebody put on LinkedIn about when not to use Gen AI. And it was an example of somebody asking a Gen AI tool to produce a project plan for them. And of course, a lot of the important part of project planning is sitting around a table, making sure you've understood the dependencies and everybody being on the same page. And there's a very human element to that. And I don't think Gen AI is always the right thing to reach for when you're trying to generate content. But it's an interesting space.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think there'll be some interesting use cases that come out where companies have tried to use Gen AI for things that maybe aren't quite right, and there are going to be some horror stories, I'm sure. So I guess just to finish off, we're almost out of time. So imagine I'm a CDO or a head of BI and analytics at a global CPG business. I've just joined a new company. There's Excel spreadsheets everywhere. I've got disconnected data. I've got people asking me what I'm going to do about Gen AI and AI. All of these things coming at me. What's the number one thing you would do? And you're only allowed to pick one. What's the first thing you would do in the organization? And Freddie, I'm gonna throw that at you.
For me, I think I would start with figuring out what's the data maturity in the organization. That would be the number one key that I would want to understand before I can answer any more questions as to where do we go next. Because if you're very low on the maturity scale, there might be a lot more building blocks you might have to put in place before you can get really, to more of the aspirational stage of getting to Gen AI or any of the, advanced techniques, especially in a scalable, consistent manner.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, that would definitely be a great place to start. So, Tim, what are your thoughts?
Well, very difficult to nail it down to one, but I think probably the first thing I would do is look at the people aspect of it. And I would understand which people are in data roles and what those roles are. We were talking a little bit about this before in one of the points, but I think a really great model is where you've got a partnership between a business data owner, so somebody that's a champion of the data within the business, who understands what it means and what it's for, who's partnered with let's call it a data product manager within a kind of more traditional IT function. You put those two things together, and I think you can make some great strides with improving the quality of data, adoption, and democratization of it. So I would probably focus on the people bit first and go from there.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you both so much for joining us on the podcast today. Some fantastic topics ranging from governance to Gen AI to bridging the gap between business and technology is the theme that came up quite a lot. But listen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you both. Hopefully, the content from the podcast today has given some value to the listeners. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to the Snap, Crackle and Pod podcast. Please click this button to subscribe on YouTube. You can also follow us on all major podcast platforms. We're Snap Analytics. We help organizations make sense of data. If you want to find out more, you can go to www.snapanalytics.co.uk. Thank you.